Hey guys, tonight we step softly across cooling desert sand as the last light bleeds out of the horizon and the wind smooths away the footprints of the day. The air smells faintly of dust and stone, and somewhere in the distance a night bird calls like it knows something you don't. Ahead of you, half buried in shadow, sits a newly opened tomb entrance, a dark mouth cut into limestone thousands of years ago, sealed, forgotten, and now disturbingly open again. You pause at the threshold, because every instinct you have is whispering that this is a terrible idea. After all, you probably wouldn't survive this. Ancient Egyptians built these places to keep people out, especially curious people with flashlights and questionable judgment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, comment your location and local time. It's always fascinating to see where in the world people are listening from as we wander into the past together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the tomb entrance, noticing how the temperature drops as the heat of the day releases its grip on the stone. Ancient Egypt was a land obsessed with permanence. Floods came and went, rulers rose and fell, but stone endured. The pyramids at Giza have stood for over 4,500 years, already ancient when Cleopatra lived closer in time to us than to their construction. The people who built tombs like this believed death was not an ending but a transition, a long journey requiring preparation, protection, and careful planning. The doorway is low, forcing you to bow your head as you enter, an accidental gesture of respect, or perhaps a deliberate architectural reminder of your place among the dead. Inside, the air is still and dry. Your footsteps echo softly, absorbed by walls etched with faint carvings and painted symbols dulled by time. Hieroglyphs run along the corridor walls in orderly columns. Birds, eyes, reeds, seated figures. To ancient Egyptians, these were not merely decorations. They were language imbued with power. Words, when written, were believed to become real. A carved loaf of bread could nourish a spirit. A painted door could open in the afterlife. Historians still argue whether these images were meant purely symbolically or believed to function literally in the spiritual realm. You sweep your light across a panel showing a figure offering food to a seated noble. Bread, beer, onions, roasted fowl, provisions for eternity. Egyptians feared a second death, the annihilation of the soul if the body decayed or offering ceased. Survival in the afterlife depended on remembrance, ritual, and preservation. The corridor slopes downward, and the silence grows thicker the deeper you go. It is the kind of silence that feels occupied rather than empty, as if sound itself has been politely asked to leave. It's easy to imagine why ancient tombs became associated with curses. Even in antiquity, these spaces were not meant for the living. Tomb inscriptions sometimes warned intruders with threats both practical and supernatural. One Old Kingdom tomb inscription warns that anyone who disturbs the burial will be judged by the great god and lose their earthly status, a terrifying prospect in a society where legacy meant everything. Yet despite warnings, tomb robbing was common. Economic hardship and the lure of gold made burial sites irresistible. Entire networks of looters existed, sometimes with help from corrupt officials. Ironically, some of the very workers who built royal tombs later returned to plunder them. You brush your fingers lightly along the wall and feel the fine dust gather on your skin, particles of limestone, ancient plaster, perhaps even linen fibers carried on desert winds over centuries. The dryness here is remarkable. Egypt's arid climate is one of the main reasons mummies survived at all. In wetter environments, bodies decay quickly. Here, desiccation slows time itself. A faint scent lingers beneath the dust, resin, maybe, or the ghost of oils once poured in ritual abundance. Egyptians used aromatic resins like myrrh and cedar oil not only for preservation, but for sacred purification. Some scholars believe the scent itself held ritual importance, symbolizing divine presence and transformation. Your light catches a shallow niche carved into the wall. Inside sits a small clay figure, a Shabti, hands crossed, holding miniature tools. These servant figurines were placed in tombs to perform labor for the deceased in the afterlife. Wealthy burials could include hundreds of them, ensuring the tomb owner would never have to farm, haul water, or repair irrigation canals for eternity. Convenient, really. Further in, the passage narrows. You become aware of your breathing, of the soft crunch beneath your shoes, of the steady rhythm of your pulse. Ancient tomb architecture often emphasized transition, from light to darkness, from noise to silence, from the world of the living to the realm beyond. The deeper chambers symbolize the underworld, mirroring the sun god Ra's nightly journey through darkness before rebirth at dawn. And here you are, following that path in reverse, a living visitor moving into the space designed for the dead. Somewhere above, sand shifts softly in the night wind. Down here, time feels sealed, layered, patient. You pause at a sealed inner doorway, its plaster cracked but intact, stamped with faint impressions of ancient seals. A jackal shape, Anubis, guardian of cemeteries, is still visible despite centuries of erosion. The seal was meant to remain unbroken for eternity, yet it did not. Whether opened by priests, robbers, or archaeologists, this barrier once gave way, and with it came the long human fascination with what lies beyond death. You stand in the dim stillness, feeling the weight of thousands of years pressing gently but unmistakably around you. And though nothing moves, you cannot shake the sense that this place was designed to watch, to remember, and perhaps to wait. The deeper you move into the corridor, the more the walls begin to feel intentional, not merely carved, but insistent. Your light glides across another band of hieroglyphs, and here the tone shifts. The figures are no longer offering bread and beer. They stand rigid, formal, commanding. Lines of text march in neat rows beneath them, each symbol cut with the deliberate care of someone who expected these words to last forever. You stop because something about the composition feels less welcoming. Ancient Egyptian tomb inscriptions were often protective, and sometimes they were blunt. A number of Old and Middle Kingdom tombs include warnings directed at anyone who might disturb the burial. One inscription discovered near Saqqara warns that anyone who harms the tomb owner will be judged by the gods and denied their inheritance. Another threatens that a crocodile, a hippopotamus, and a serpent will devour the intruder. An imaginative trio that suggests the author wanted to cover all terrain: river, marsh, and nightmare. You tilt your light closer to the wall. The carved figures seem to watch in profile, their eyes painted forward in that unmistakable Egyptian style, bodies in profile, gaze confronting you head-on. The effect is unsettling, like being assessed by a system older than your language. The Egyptians did not think of these inscriptions as decoration. Words possessed Heka, a form of divine magic inherent in speech and writing. To write a spell was to activate it. To carve a name was to grant it endurance. To erase a name was to destroy a person's existence in the afterlife. Historians still argue whether protective tomb warnings were believed to function literally or served as psychological deterrents. But in a culture where writing held sacred power, the line between symbolism and reality was thin. You notice a section where the text is framed by carved reed bundles and protective symbols: Ankhs for life, Jed pillars for stability, and the Eye of Horus for healing and protection. The repetition feels less like ornament and more like reinforcement, as if the wall itself is armored with meaning. One translated warning from a noble's tomb reads, "As for anyone who shall enter this tomb in impurity, judgment shall be passed upon him." Not exactly a warm welcome. The concept of ritual purity mattered deeply. Priests shaved their bodies, bathed frequently, and wore clean linen before performing rites. Entering a sacred space improperly was not merely disrespectful, it risked cosmic disorder. You glance at your shoes, dusty from the desert floor, and decide it is probably best not to think too hard about ancient standards of cleanliness. A faint carving near the base of the wall catches your eye. It shows a figure kneeling before a table of offerings, while another figure raises a hand in a gesture scholars interpret as either blessing or command. Beneath it runs a short inscription invoking protection for the tomb owner's Ka, the life force that required nourishment and remembrance. The Egyptians believed a person consisted of multiple spiritual components: the Ka life force, the Ba personality, often depicted as a bird with a human head, and the Ak, the transfigured spirit. For eternal survival, these elements needed the body, the name, and ritual offerings to remain intact. A disturbed tomb threatened that delicate balance. Your light flickers over an area where the carvings appear intentionally defaced, faces scratched away, names chiseled out. This wasn't erosion, this was deliberate. In ancient Egypt, erasing a name was an act of ultimate punishment. Without a name, the deceased could not receive offerings or exist in the afterlife. This practice, known today as damnatio memoriae, was used against political enemies and disgraced officials. Even in death, reputation mattered. The air grows cooler as the passage bends slightly. Sound feels muffled, as though the tomb absorbs vibrations rather than echoing them. It becomes easy to understand how early explorers described a heavy atmosphere inside sealed chambers. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists and treasure hunters often entered tombs with little understanding of preservation. Some reported dizziness, breathing discomfort, or strange odors. Today, scientists suggest that sealed tombs can contain mold spores, ancient bacteria, and toxic gases released from decomposing organic materials. What earlier generations attributed to curses may have been environmental hazards meeting dramatic storytelling. Still, as you move forward, it's not science that occupies your imagination. It's the warnings. Near the end of the corridor, your beam catches a final inscription band, painted rather than carved. The pigments, red ochre, carbon black, traces of yellow, remain surprisingly vivid. The text is framed by protective deities with outstretched wings. The message is not long. It does not need to be. Protection is invoked. Harm is promised to those who disturb. Divine witnesses are named. You notice how the figures face outward toward you, not inward toward the tomb's owner. Their stance feels less ceremonial and more defensive, guardians stationed at a threshold between worlds. Even if you don't believe in curses, you understand their function. They were legal notices, spiritual safeguards, psychological deterrents, and expressions of genuine religious conviction all at once. And here, in the deepening quiet, they do exactly what they were designed to do. They make you hesitate, because beyond this point lies not just a burial, but an elaborate system built to defeat time, decay, theft, and oblivion, guarded not only by stone and ritual, but by the human fear of consequences seen and unseen. You shift your light toward the darkness ahead, aware that each step forward carries you deeper into a place designed to remain undisturbed. And somewhere in the stillness, beneath layers of dust and devotion, the warnings linger, patient, carved and waiting to be read by anyone bold enough to continue. Beyond the warning inscriptions, the corridor widens into a preparation chamber, a space that feels less like a tomb and more like a workshop paused mid-breath. The ceiling is low, supported by rough-cut stone beams darkened by time. Your light travels across shallow stone tables, narrow channels carved into the floor, and faint stains that have long since surrendered their original color. This is where the work of eternity began, not in silence, but in careful, methodical procedure. You pause beside a stone platform worn smooth at the edges. Thousands of years ago, a body would have rested here, newly dead yet destined for forever. The Egyptians did not consider the corpse an empty shell. It remained the anchor for the soul's return. Without preservation, the Ka and Ba could not reunite. Without reunion, there could be no afterlife. Mummification, in its most refined form, took about 70 days. A number scholars connect to the heliacal rising of Sirius and the Nile's flood cycle, though historians still argue whether the timeline was symbolic or practical. Either way, the process was precise. You imagine the first stage, purification. The body washed with palm wine and Nile water, cleansed both physically and ritually. Priests wearing linen masks depicting Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, oversaw the procedure. The jackal was associated with cemeteries, likely because real jackals prowled desert burial grounds. By invoking Anubis, embalmers sought divine protection and guidance. The next step was the most delicate, removal of the brain. Using a hooked instrument inserted through the nostril, embalmers broke apart the brain and extracted it in fragments. It sounds unsettling, but the brain was not considered the seat of intelligence. The heart held that role, the center of thought, memory, and morality. The cranial cavity was rinsed and filled with resin or linen packing. A small incision was made in the left side of the abdomen. Through this opening, the stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines were removed. Each organ was carefully dried and preserved. The heart, however, remained in place whenever possible. In the afterlife, it would be weighed against the feather of Mad, goddess of truth. A heart heavy with wrongdoing risked annihilation by the devouring creature Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Not exactly the companion you want waiting at judgment. Nearby, you notice a shallow depression carved into the floor that may have collected runoff during washing and purification. Resin stains mark the stone in dark, glossy patches. Egyptians used substances like cedar oil, pine resin, beeswax, and bitumen for preservation and sealing. Some of these materials possessed antimicrobial properties, though their ritual significance was just as important. After organ removal, the body was packed and covered in natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture found in dry lake beds. Natron drew moisture from the flesh, halting decay. For about 40 days, the body rested in this desiccating cradle, slowly transforming from organic softness into something closer to leather and wood. You imagine the desert wind outside, the Nile flowing miles away, life continuing while this careful stillness persisted. Natron was so effective that even accidental burials in desert sand sometimes resulted in natural preservation. Archaeologists have found prehistoric remains mummified simply by arid conditions, perhaps the observation that inspired later intentional techniques. When drying was complete, the body was rinsed again and anointed with oils to restore flexibility. The cavity left by organ removal was filled with linen, sawdust, resin, or fragrant herbs to maintain shape. Artificial eyes could be inserted, cheeks padded. The goal was not merely preservation but recognition. The body needed to remain identifiable for the soul's return. On a nearby wall, faded relief carvings depict attendants presenting oils and linen rolls. One figure pours liquid from a narrow vessel while another presses cloth along the limbs of the deceased. The gestures are tender, almost domestic. Death here is not hurried, it is managed. Historians note that mummification techniques varied widely by wealth and era. Royal and elite burials received meticulous treatment, while simpler methods were used for common people. In less elaborate procedures, bodies might be salted and wrapped without organ removal. Yet even modest preservation reflected the same fundamental belief: the body mattered. Your light flickers across a painted image of Anubis bending over a wrapped form laid upon a lion-shaped funerary couch. The god's black jackal head symbolizes regeneration and the fertile silt of the Nile. Black, in Egyptian symbolism, represented rebirth rather than mourning, the color of life emerging from floodwaters. A faint resin scent still clings to the chamber, dry and slightly sweet, as if absorbed into the stone itself. Modern chemical analysis has detected traces of pistacia resin and conifer oils in mummy wrappings, confirming trade networks that stretched far beyond Egypt's borders. Preservation, it seems, was an international effort. Near the wall's base, a scatter of linen fragments lies fused with hardened resin. Linen was not simply wrapping material, it held symbolic value. Egypt's linen industry was highly advanced, and fine linen could signify status and purity. Some wrappings included recycled household textiles, a curious intimacy, as if fragments of daily life accompanied the dead into eternity. You stand in the chamber's stillness, imagining the slow rhythm of work that once filled this space. Washing, anointing, packing, drying, wrapping, gestures repeated across centuries with disciplined care. This was not an act of fear alone. It was an act of continuity. The body prepared here was not meant to remain dead. It was meant to endure, to wait, and eventually to live again in a world beyond this one. And as you move deeper into the tomb's inner chambers, you begin to understand that every step in this process was part science, part ritual, and part promise. A promise that time, decay, and oblivion could be resisted with enough care, enough faith, and enough linen. From the preparation chamber, The passage angles into a smaller side room carved with surprising precision, as if this space served a purpose too important to leave to rough stone and shadow. Your light reveals a low platform built into the wall and arranged along it, shallow recesses shaped to cradle vessels. Even empty, the arrangement feels ceremonial, a place where something vital once rested, guarded as carefully as the body itself. This is where the organs were entrusted to eternity. The ancient Egyptians believed the human being was an intricate system of physical and spiritual components, and while the body required preservation, the organs removed during mummification still held essential roles in the afterlife. To discard them would have been unthinkable. Instead, they were dried, wrapped, and placed into canopic jars, protective containers watched over by divine guardians. You imagine 4 vessels resting here, smooth stone or alabaster, lids carved in the likeness of sacred heads. Each jar held a specific organ, and each was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti, human-headed, guarded the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, protected the lungs. Duamudef, jackal-headed, watched over the stomach. Kebesenu, falcon-headed, safeguarded the intestines. Together, they formed a defensive perimeter around the deceased's vulnerable inner life. The jars themselves were often placed within a canopic chest or niche near the sarcophagus, oriented carefully according to ritual direction. Protective goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket, were invoked to shield them. Protection in ancient Egypt was rarely singular. It layered itself through symbols, deities, spells, and careful placement. Historians still argue whether the organs were believed to be physically needed in the afterlife, or whether their preservation served symbolic completeness. Either way, the message is clear. Nothing essential was left to chance. You crouch slightly to examine faint painted outlines remaining in one recess, traces of blue pigment, and a narrow band of hieroglyphs invoking protection. Blue in Egyptian art symbolized the heavens and the primeval waters of creation. Even the color palette reinforced cosmic order, but not every burial kept the organs separate. By the New Kingdom period, embalmers sometimes treated and returned the organs to the body cavity, while canopic jars remained present symbolically. In some tombs, the jars were solid replicas, never intended to hold anything at all. Ritual meaning, it seems, could endure even when practical function changed. Near the niches, you notice small carved depressions and fastening grooves, suggesting a chest or protective casing once stood here. Tomb equipment was arranged with deliberate geometry, not cluttered but orchestrated. Egyptians believed order, or ma'at, sustained the universe. Even in burial, symmetry and balance mattered. Your light drifts to the wall where rows of amulets are carved in relief. Tiny ankhs, scarabs, knots of Isis, jed pillars, and miniature hearts. These shapes were not merely decorative motifs. They represent protective amulets placed within the wrappings or around the body to shield the deceased from harm. The heart scarab, often placed over the chest, carried a spell from the Book of the Dead, urging the heart not to testify against its owner during judgment. The jed pillar symbolized stability and endurance. The Tayit knot of Isis offered maternal protection. Even the humble Wadjet eye guarded against illness and misfortune. Actual amulets were made from faience, carnelian, lapis lazuli, gold, or glazed composition. Their materials carried meaning. Gold symbolized the flesh of the gods. Lapis evoked the night sky. Green stones represented rebirth and regeneration. In one corner of the chamber floor, you spot a tiny fragment glinting in your beam, a shard of blue faience, its glaze dulled but still luminous. Faience was not true ceramic but a silica-based material that produced a glassy surface when fired. It shimmered like water in sunlight, an echo of the Nile's life-giving flow. Amulets were not placed randomly. Some were positioned at specific points along the body to correspond with vulnerability and spiritual transition. The placement formed an invisible armor beneath the linen layers. Protection here was intimate. The air in the chamber feels even drier than the corridor, as if sealed spaces preserved not only objects but stillness itself. You imagine priests murmuring invocations as each jar was sealed, each amulet positioned, each element aligned with cosmic order. Even the direction the body faced could matter. West was associated with the land of the dead, where the sun set each evening before its nightly journey through the underworld. Many necropolises were built on the Nile's western bank for this reason. To be buried facing west was to join the sun's cycle of death and rebirth. Your light sweeps the chamber once more, and you realize how methodical everything feels. Nothing accidental, nothing casual. Every jar, symbol, and charm functioned as part of a larger spiritual technology designed to ensure safe passage beyond death. And yet, there is something deeply human beneath the ritual precision. Someone cared enough to protect what remained. Someone feared what might be lost. Someone hoped protection would be enough. Beyond this room lies the deeper heart of the tomb, where the body itself would rest, wrapped, guarded, and surrounded by layers of meaning, meant to endure longer than memory. You linger a moment longer in the quiet, sensing how protection here was never loud or dramatic. It was careful, specific, patient. And as you step back into the corridor, you carry the growing awareness that the ancient Egyptians did not trust eternity to a single safeguard. They trusted it to layers of stone, symbol, prayer, and devotion, each one reinforcing the next in a silent promise that the journey beyond death would not be faced alone. The next chamber feels narrower, more intimate, as if designed not for ceremony but for close, careful work. The air seems to hold a faint sweetness beneath the dryness, resin warmed by human hands thousands of years ago, absorbed into linen and stone, and left here like a memory that never fully evaporated. Your light reveals long stone benches along the wall and shallow baskets carved into the rock, their interiors darkened by residue that time has not entirely erased. This is where the wrapping began, the slow transformation from preserved body to protected being. Linen strips were laid out in careful rolls, some coarse, others fine enough to pass for royal cloth. Egypt's linen production was among the most advanced in the ancient world. Flax fibers were spun into thread and woven into textiles so fine that Greek writers later compared them to woven air. The quality of linen used in wrapping often reflected the status of the deceased, though even modest burials received careful attention. You imagine the embalmers beginning at the fingers and toes, wrapping each digit individually before moving inward. Resin was brushed between layers to seal and adhere the linen, forming a protective shell. The scent of heated resin, pine, cedar, pistacia would have filled the chamber, both practical and sacred. These substances helped deter insects and bacteria, but they also carried symbolic meaning: purification, sanctification, transformation. Historians have found that some mummies contain hundreds of meters of linen wrapping. The layering created both physical protection and spiritual armor. Each bandage was placed with intention, sometimes accompanied by whispered invocations to safeguard the body against decay, demons, or misfortune in the afterlife. Your light passes over a shallow depression containing hardened resin drips that glisten like black glass. The embalmers worked methodically, pausing to insert amulets between layers, hidden protections meant never to be seen again. A scarab might rest over the heart, a wadjet eye at the throat, a jed pillar along the spine for stability in the afterlife. These objects were tucked into the wrappings like secrets meant only for eternity. Protection here was quiet, patient, and deeply specific. Some mummies have been discovered with written spells tucked within the linen folds, small papyrus strips containing protective texts. Others include tiny models of tools, miniature sandals, or symbolic tokens intended to provide comfort and utility beyond death. The body, once wrapped, became a carefully managed universe of meanings layered beneath cloth. You notice a carved relief on the wall showing attendants wrapping a figure while a priest raises a censer, releasing curls of incense smoke. Incense played an important ritual role, believed to purify spaces and invite divine presence. Frankincense and myrrh, imported through long-distance trade routes, were precious commodities, proof that preparing the dead connected Egypt to a broader ancient world. The wrapping was not merely practical. It reshaped the body into an idealized form. Padding was added to restore lifelike contours. Linen rolls were placed beneath the cheeks, along the limbs, and across the torso to preserve recognizable shape. The deceased was not meant to appear lifeless but preserved in a state of serene permanence. Over the face, embalmers sometimes placed a funerary mask, cartonnage molded from linen and plaster, painted and gilded to present an eternal likeness. Gold, when used, symbolized divine flesh and incorruptibility. Even those who could not afford gold might receive painted masks that offered dignity and identity. The final wrappings created the familiar cocoon shape, but this form was more than aesthetic. It evoked Osiris, god of rebirth, who was often depicted as a wrapped figure. To be wrapped was to be aligned with divine resurrection. Near the base of the wall, you notice a carved scene depicting Isis and Nephthys standing at the head and foot of a bier, wings outstretched in protection. Their presence in funerary imagery emphasized maternal guardianship and cosmic order. Death was not abandonment, it was transition under watchful care. Some mummies show evidence of multiple rewrapping episodes centuries later. Priests of later dynasties reopened tombs to repair damage, replace wrappings, and restore dignity to the dead. This suggests a continuing cultural responsibility, an ongoing duty to maintain the integrity of the deceased long after burial. Yet the process was not immune to adaptation. In certain periods, embalmers painted amulets directly onto wrappings rather than inserting physical objects, perhaps due to cost or changing beliefs. Symbolism endured even when materials shifted. You brush a fingertip along the stone bench and feel the faint tackiness of ancient resin preserved in the pores of the rock. It's astonishing to think that organic substances applied by human hands thousands of years ago still linger here. Outside, the desert wind continues its patient work, reshaping dunes grain by grain. Inside, linen and resin conspired to halt time. The deeper you stand in this chamber, the more you sense that wrapping was an act of reassurance, layer over layer, protection over vulnerability, intention over inevitability. The embalmers were not merely preserving a body, they were constructing security against chaos. And as the final layers were tied and sealed, the individual beneath them disappeared from sight, not lost, but safeguarded, hidden within a protective cocoon meant to endure longer than memory itself. Soon, the wrapped form would be ready to leave this chamber, carried deeper into the tomb where stone, darkness, and sacred geometry would complete the work begun here. But for a moment longer, the room holds the echo of careful hands, resin-scented air, and linen drawn tight in a quiet promise. Nothing essential will be left unprotected. The corridor narrows once more, guiding you toward the deepest part of the tomb, a place designed not for preparation, but for departure. Your footsteps soften against a floor worn smooth by ancient sandals, and the air grows noticeably cooler, as though the stone itself is holding its breath. Ahead, the passage opens into a chamber larger than the others, its ceiling rising just enough to create a sense of solemn space rather than confinement. This is where the final rites unfolded. Your light glides across the walls, revealing painted scenes arranged in careful registers. Priests stand in profile, their linen garments rendered in faded white and pale ochre. One raises a ritual ad-shaped tool toward the face of a wrapped figure standing upright before a tomb entrance. This scene represents the opening of the mouth ceremony, a crucial rite intended to restore the deceased's senses in the afterlife. Through this ritual, the dead were believed to regain the ability to breathe, speak, see, hear, and eat. Without it, eternity would be a silent, senseless existence. The ceremony was performed using specialized instruments, adzes, incense burners, libation vessels, and ritual blades. Some tools were practical, others were purely symbolic. Historians still argue whether the rite was believed to physically animate the senses or functioned as a sacred dramatization ensuring spiritual completeness. Either way, the ritual underscored a fundamental belief. Death was not the end of experience. You imagine priests circling the wrapped body, incense smoke drifting upward in thin spirals. Libations of milk, water, and beer were poured. Oils were applied. Prayers were recited in rhythmic cadence. Family members might have been present, though grief here was structured by ritual, ordered, purposeful, contained. Near the center of the chamber floor, a shallow groove outlines where a bier or coffin may once have rested during the rites. The geometry of the room suggests careful planning. Egyptian tomb architecture often mirrored cosmic order, aligning space with celestial cycles and symbolic direction. West, the land of the setting sun, remained the destination of the dead. A painted procession along the wall shows attendants carrying furniture, chests, jars, and food offerings. Beds, chairs, and headrests accompany the deceased into eternity. In elite burials, even board games like Senet were included, perhaps the oldest board game known, symbolizing passage through the afterlife. The idea that one might pass eternity with both spiritual trials and leisurely recreation feels oddly comforting. One attendant leads a calf by rope in the painted scene, an offering meant to sustain the deceased. Food was essential, both symbolically and spiritually. Offerings depicted on tomb walls could magically provide nourishment through the power of representation. A painted loaf could feed a soul. A carved goose could satisfy hunger forever. Your light pauses on a depiction of mourners with raised arms, their gestures stylized yet expressive. Professional mourners were sometimes hired to amplify ritual grief, ensuring the ceremony fulfilled social and religious expectations. Mourning here was not only personal, it was performative, ensuring proper passage between worlds. In one corner, faint traces of hieratic script, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, list offerings and ritual invocations. These texts served as both inventory and invocation, ensuring that what was promised in ceremony remained available eternally. The wrapped body, now transformed into a mummy, would have been placed within nested coffins, sometimes several layers deep, before resting inside a stone sarcophagus. Each layer added protection and symbolic reinforcement. The innermost coffin preserved the body. The outer layers proclaimed identity and divine association. Gold leaf painted faces, protective deities with outstretched wings. Each coffin layer reinforced the promise of rebirth. Near the chamber's rear wall stands a recessed niche where the sarcophagus likely once rested. The stone floor beneath it bears faint scoring marks from ancient placement. You imagine the weight of the coffin lowered carefully into position, ropes creaking, voices hushed. Then came the sealing. Priests spoke final invocations. Offerings were arranged. Protective spells were recited. The entrance to the burial chamber was closed with stone blocks and sealed with plaster bearing official stamps, impressions that signaled sacred closure and legal protection. Breaking such a seal was not merely theft, it was violation. Outside, desert sand waited patiently to conceal the entrance. Within, darkness settled into permanence. Some tombs included false doors carved into walls, symbolic portals through which the spirit could pass to receive offerings. Others included hidden shafts and blocking stones intended to deter robbers. Despite these measures, many tombs were eventually breached, their contents scattered across centuries of looting and rediscovery. Yet in this moment, at the close of burial, the tomb was considered complete, secure, and eternal. You stand in the quiet chamber, imagining the final stone sliding into place, sealing the world of the living away. The last torch extinguished, the last footstep fading down the passage. Silence then, not empty silence, but the deliberate stillness of a space designed to endure without disturbance. The Egyptians did not see this sealing as abandonment. It was fulfillment. The deceased had been prepared, protected, equipped, and guided. The rituals ensured the journey ahead would unfold according to divine order. And as you stand where priests once spoke their final words, you sense the gravity of that closing moment, the firm, quiet certainty that everything necessary had been done. Beyond this chamber lies only darkness and the slow passage of time. Behind you lies the world of breath and movement. Between them, sealed in stone and ritual, rests a promise of eternity. Leaving the burial chamber behind, you retrace your steps through the corridor, but something in your awareness has shifted. The silence no longer feels neutral, it feels guarded. Tombs like this were designed to remain sealed forever, yet history shows that forever is a fragile promise when weighed against hunger, desperation, and human curiosity. Long before modern archaeologists arrived with notebooks and careful brushes, others came in the night with chisels, rope, and urgency. Tomb robbing in ancient Egypt was not rare, it was persistent. Even during the height of pharaonic power, grave looting posed a serious threat. Gold funerary masks, jewelry, amulets, and precious oils represented staggering wealth sealed in darkness. For someone struggling to survive, a sealed tomb might have looked less like sacred space and more like opportunity. You pause beside a fracture in the plaster seal near a doorway, a crack widened long ago by tools rather than time. The break is rough, hurried, pragmatic. Whoever forced entry here likely worked by flickering lamplight, listening for distant footsteps, aware that the penalty for desecrating royal or elite burials could be severe. Ancient records confirm this fear. During the New Kingdom, a series of trials documented in papyri describe captured tomb robbers confessing under interrogation. One group admitted to tunneling into a royal tomb, stripping the mummy of gold and burning the coffin to extract precious metals. Punishments ranged from beatings and mutilation to execution. Still, the looting continued. Historians still argue whether widespread economic instability during certain periods increased tomb robbery, or whether the concentration of wealth in burial practices made the temptation simply too great to resist. The corridor narrows near the fracture, and you imagine the tension of squeezing through with stolen goods tied in cloth bundles. Oil lamps sputtering, the air thick with dust and resin, every sound magnified by fear. Yet not all intruders came out of desperation. Some were insiders. Workers who built tombs possessed intimate knowledge of hidden passages and blocking stones. During times of political turmoil, even officials responsible for guarding burial sites were implicated in theft. The Valley of the Kings, despite its isolation and secrecy, suffered repeated robberies within decades of royal burials. You sweep your light across the wall and notice chisel marks that do not match the original carving style. A face removed from relief, a necklace carefully hacked away. Damage guided by value rather than vandalism. Gold could be melted, precious stones could be sold. Sacred meaning, however, was left behind, shattered but lingering. Despite this, tomb builders attempted ingenious defenses. Hidden shafts, false corridors, and heavy blocking stones were designed to confuse intruders. Some tombs included deep wells intended to flood passageways during rare rains, creating natural barriers. Others concealed burial chambers behind multiple turns and sealed doorways. Protection was architectural as well as spiritual. A faint carving near the wall shows a jackal reclining atop a shrine, Anubis again, guardian of necropolises. His presence served as both divine protection and psychological warning. Even hardened thieves might hesitate before desecrating a space believed to be watched by a god of the dead. And yet, history shows that hesitation rarely lasts long when survival is at stake. You imagine a looter pausing in the dark, reading a curse inscription by lamplight. Did he laugh it off? Did he hesitate? Did he whisper an apology before breaking the seal? We cannot know. But we do know that tomb robbery became so widespread that priests of the 21st dynasty undertook a remarkable effort. They relocated royal mummies to hidden caches for protection. Pharaohs, including Ramses II and Seti I, were reburied in secret tombs to safeguard them from desecration. These caches were discovered only in the 19th century, their occupants layered together in an unexpected afterlife of shared refuge. In a small alcove near the corridor floor, you notice fragments of broken pottery, likely ancient oil lamps. Their soot once clung to chamber ceilings, leaving dark smudges still visible in places. The presence of such lamps is often one of the clearest signs of ancient intrusion. The air here feels faintly disturbed, as though the tomb remembers movement long after footsteps have faded. Not all intrusions ended in theft. Some robbers were interrupted. Others abandoned attempts when confronted with unexpected barriers. In rare cases, objects were left scattered in haste, evidence of panic in a place meant to enforce stillness. You pause, listening to the soft hush of your own breathing. It's easy to imagine curses as supernatural vengeance, but their original function may have been deeply human. Deterrence through fear. Threaten divine judgment, promise suffering, invoke monsters. Anything to make a trespasser hesitate long enough to reconsider. And yet, the persistence of tomb robbery suggests a truth as old as civilization itself. Necessity and desire often outweigh fear. Still, something about these corridors encourages restraint. The weight of stone, the stillness of air, the awareness that this place was built with reverence and sealed with intention. You move slowly past the fractured seal, aware that every mark in this passage tells a story of devotion, violation, fear, and survival layered across centuries. Behind you lie chambers prepared with meticulous care. Before you stretches the uncertain boundary between reverence and intrusion. And somewhere in the long silence of this tomb, the memory of ancient footsteps lingers, hurried, cautious, and echoing with the knowledge that they did not belong. As you continue through the dim corridor, the carvings begin to change again. The scenes no longer show human attendance or earthly rituals. Instead, the walls fill with figures that belong to another order of existence, beings with animal heads, elaborate crowns, and still, forward gazes that seem less decorative and more judicial. The air feels no different, yet your awareness sharpens, as though you've stepped into a space meant not for preparation or protection, but for judgment. A towering figure painted along the wall stands wrapped like a mummy, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and holding the crook and flail across his chest. His skin is rendered in deep green, the color of regeneration and fertile life. This is Osiris, lord of the afterlife, ruler of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, an embodiment of death followed by rebirth. According to Egyptian belief, Osiris was once a king murdered and dismembered by his brother Set. Reassembled and revived by Isis, he became the eternal ruler of the dead. In death, Egyptians hoped to identify with Osiris, sharing in his resurrection. To be buried properly was to join his cycle of renewal. Nearby stands Anubis, sleek and watchful, his jackal head angled in quiet vigilance. He appears in funerary scenes as both protector and guide, leading the deceased toward judgment. Real jackals prowled desert cemeteries, and their presence likely inspired the god's form, a reminder that even divine imagery emerged from observation of the natural world. Historians still argue whether Egyptians imagined these deities as literal beings encountered after death or as symbolic expressions of cosmic principles. In tomb art, the distinction hardly matters. Their presence is absolute. Your light moves across a long scene depicting the weighing of the heart, one of the most recognizable moments in Egyptian afterlife belief. A scale stands at the center. On one side rests the heart of the deceased. On the other lies the feather of Mad, representing truth, balance, and cosmic order. Anubis adjusts the scale. Thoth, ibis-headed god of writing and knowledge, stands ready to record the result. And crouched nearby waits Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a composite predator assembled from the Nile's most feared animals. If the heart proves heavy with wrongdoing, Ammit devours it, condemning the soul to a second and final death. It is not eternal torment that Egyptians feared most. It is obliteration. You linger on the carved feather, delicate yet precise. Ma'at was more than moral truth. She represented the fundamental order of the universe. Pharaohs were tasked with maintaining Ma'at on earth, ensuring harmony between people, gods, and nature. In death, each individual faced the same principle. Had they lived in balance, the idea feels surprisingly intimate. Beyond the judgment scene, rows of protective deities line the walls. Some hold knives, others extend wings. Many stand in rigid symmetry, guardians stationed at thresholds invisible to the living. Their presence suggests that the afterlife journey was not passive. It required safe passage through gates, guardians, and tests. A panel shows the Ba, the human-headed bird representing personality and mobility, hovering above a mummy. By day, the Ba could leave the tomb and move between worlds. By night, it returned to reunite with the body. This daily cycle mirrored the sun's journey, reinforcing the connection between cosmic rhythm and personal survival. You notice that many figures face inward toward doorways painted on the walls, symbolic portals between realms. These false doors were believed to allow the spirit to pass through to receive offerings. To the living eye, they are flat carvings. To the dead, they were thresholds. The Egyptians imagined the Duat not as a simple underworld, but but as a vast landscape of rivers, caverns, gates, and fields. The field of reeds, often depicted as a lush mirror of the Nile Valley, represented an idealized afterlife where crops grew tall and labor was effortless. For a civilization shaped by agriculture and flood cycles, eternity looked like a perfected harvest season. Near the base of the wall, you see small knife-wielding figures standing atop serpents. These protective guardians appear in funerary texts as defenders against chaos. Serpents symbolized both danger and regeneration. Controlling them demonstrated mastery over disorder. Even in death, the Egyptians expected obstacles. A faint band of text above the figures invokes safe passage through the gates of the Jewett. Spells often addressed gatekeepers by name, ensuring the deceased could pass unharmed. Knowledge, it seems, functioned as a key. To know the right words was to move safely forward. You pause in the stillness, absorbing the quiet authority of these images. They do not threaten, they assess, they observe, they enforce balance. The deeper symbolism becomes clearer. The tomb was not merely a resting place. It was a launch point into a structured cosmic journey governed by order, morality, and divine oversight. And standing here, surrounded by silent judges and guardians, you sense why preparation mattered so deeply. Preservation protected the body. Ritual protected the spirit. But ultimately, survival in the afterlife depended on balance, on a life lived in harmony with the principles embodied by man. Your light drifts once more across the scale, the feather, the waiting creature, and the calm precision of Anubis adjusting the balance. In this quiet chamber, eternity is not chaos. It is measured. And somewhere beyond these carved walls lies a path where the soul must stand, be weighed, and hope to pass, not by wealth, status, or power, but by the lightness of his own heart. As you move farther along the painted corridor, the walls begin to resemble a guidebook rather than a memorial. Rows of symbols stretch in horizontal bands, interspersed with figures navigating gates, rivers, and strange landscapes populated by beings both protective and perilous. This is not decoration for the living. It is instruction for the dead, a carefully constructed roadmap through the Jewett, the Egyptian underworld. What you are seeing is often called the Book of the Dead, though ancient Egyptians knew these texts by a more poetic name, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Rather than a single fixed volume, it was a collection of spells, prayers, and navigational guidance meant to help the deceased safely traverse the afterlife and emerge renewed with the rising sun. Your light traces a line of hieroglyphs painted with surprising clarity. Each symbol carries phonetic and symbolic meaning, forming invocations that could be spoken or simply known. Knowledge itself was protective. To know the names of guardians, gates, and divine beings granted safe passage. Historians still argue whether the deceased was believed to literally recite these spells, or whether their presence alone ensured protection. Either way, the tomb walls functioned like an eternal memory aid. One painted scene shows a figure approaching a gate guarded by fearsome beings holding knives. The accompanying text instructs the traveler to identify the gatekeepers by name and declare purity before being allowed to pass. In the Jewett, recognition and correct speech meant survival. The emphasis on naming reflects a broader Egyptian belief. To know something's true name was to hold power over it. Names preserved identity, ensured remembrance, and secured existence beyond death. Nearby, a solar bark glides across painted waters. The sun god Ra sails through the underworld each night, battling chaos before rising again at dawn. The deceased hope to join this nightly journey, participating in the cycle of cosmic renewal. To travel with Ra was to share in perpetual rebirth. You notice serpents coiled beneath the boat, their bodies stylized in looping patterns. Serpents represented both danger and renewal. The nightly defeat of the chaos serpent Apophis symbolized the triumph of order. Protective spells often called upon divine forces to repel such threats during the journey. A small vignette depicts the deceased plowing fields in the field of reeds, the idealized afterlife landscape. The crops stand taller than a person, canals run clear, and the sky arches calm and endless above. This was not an abstract heaven. It was a perfected Egypt, free from flood failure, drought, taxation, and backbreaking labor. Conveniently, Shabti figures, like the small servant statue you saw earlier, were intended to perform agricultural work on behalf of the deceased. Some tomb owners included hundreds, each inscribed with spell 6 from the Book of the Dead, instructing them to answer when called to labor in the afterlife. Even in eternity, delegation was appreciated. Your light pauses over a painted heart scarab and accompanying text urging the heart not to testify against its owner. This spell, one of the most famous, reflects the anxiety surrounding judgment. A person might deceive others in life, but the heart was believed to record truth. The afterlife journey was not passive drifting. It required preparation, moral integrity, and knowledge. Spells addressed dangers such as fire lakes, hostile spirits, and disorienting darkness. Others ensured the ability to breathe, drink water, and avoid walking upside down, an oddly specific concern that appears in several funerary texts. Scholars debate whether these hazards were metaphorical or part of a vividly imagined cosmology. The Egyptians did not separate symbolic and literal realities, as modern thought often does. A lake of fire could represent both spiritual peril and an actual obstacle encountered by the soul. A band of text near the ceiling invokes the ability to transform into various forms: a falcon, a lotus, a swallow, even a serpent. These transformations allowed mobility and escape from danger. The lotus, in particular, symbolized rebirth, opening each morning with the sun. Your beam flickers across a figure kneeling beside a pool of blue pigment representing water. The accompanying spell ensures the deceased will not suffer thirst. In a desert civilization where water meant survival, the promise of endless refreshment carried profound comfort. The corridor feels less ominous now and more procedural, as though the unknown has been mapped with meticulous care. Every potential danger addressed, every gate named, every step supported by written assurance. This desire to prepare for uncertainty feels deeply human. On a lower register, a series of offering formulas repeat in tidy columns: bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen, the essentials of sustenance and comfort. Representation ensured supply. Depiction created provision. Writing made it real. Your light settles briefly on a figure emerging from a tomb doorway into daylight, arms raised, reborn with the rising sun. This image captures the ultimate goal: to come forth by day, renewed and able to move between worlds. You stand in the quiet passage, surrounded by instructions meant to guide a soul through eternity. There is something profoundly reassuring in the thoroughness, an insistence that no journey should be undertaken unprepared. The Egyptians did not trust the unknown to chance. They met it with maps, names, spells, and careful planning. And as you continue forward through the tomb's dim corridor, the painted guidance lingers behind you like a whispered assurance. The path ahead may be dark, but it has been traveled before. The corridor ahead feels subtly different, not in structure but in atmosphere. The air remains dry, the stone unmoving, and yet a quiet tension lingers in your thoughts, seeded by everything you've seen: warnings, guardians, spells, and judgment. It becomes easier to understand how stories of curses took root, growing not only from inscriptions and ritual protection, but from the unsettling feeling that some places are not meant to be disturbed. Long before modern headlines popularized the idea of mummy curses, people told stories of misfortune befalling those who violated tombs. Even in antiquity, inscriptions threatened divine punishment for intruders. But beyond carved warnings, narratives emerged, whispers of illness, accidents, and strange luck trailing those who dared disturb the dead. You pause near a section of wall where soot darkens the ceiling, evidence of ancient torches or oil lamps. The thought lingers: how many entered here with confidence and left with unease they could not explain? One Middle Kingdom inscription warns that anyone who damages the tomb will face judgment in the afterlife and lose their earthly status. Another promises that divine retribution will fall upon those who disturb sacred ground. These threats functioned partly as deterrents, but they also reflected genuine belief in cosmic justice. To violate a tomb was to disrupt man, the universal balance. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians believed supernatural punishment would occur immediately in life or only after death. Yet the fear of consequences clearly resonated across centuries. In later periods, Greek and Roman visitors to Egypt wrote about the land's ancient tombs with a mixture of fascination and dread. By then, many burial sites had already been plundered, their curses either ignored or tested by necessity. Still, stories persisted of ill fortune following those who removed burial goods. You run your light across a carved Eye of Horus, a symbol of protection and healing, repeated in careful symmetry along a decorative band. Such symbols were meant to ward off harm, but for later intruders, their presence may have amplified anxiety. When you know you're not supposed to be somewhere, every symbol begins to feel like a warning. The idea of curses gained new life during the 19th century, when European explorers and collectors removed mummies and artifacts in staggering numbers. Mummy unwrapping parties became fashionable entertainment in Victorian society, a strange blend of science, spectacle, and colonial curiosity. Some attendees reported fainting from the odor of resins and decay. Others claimed feelings of dread or dizziness. Modern science suggests sealed tomb environments can contain mold spores, fungal toxins, and bacteria capable of causing respiratory distress. In poorly ventilated spaces, ancient organic compounds can release irritants. What once seemed supernatural may have been environmental exposure combined with suggestion and fear. Yet psychological influence is powerful. When individuals believe they have violated a sacred space, stress and anxiety can manifest physically. Headaches, nausea, insomnia, heightened heart rate. The body responds to perceived danger whether or not the threat is visible. Your beam reveals a carved serpent coiled protectively around a symbol of life. Serpents in Egyptian symbolism could represent both threat and guardianship. Protection often looked like danger from the outside, a reminder that sacred spaces defend themselves in layered ways. A faint crack runs through the plaster seal of a side niche, its edges darkened by age. It's easy to imagine a looter breaking such a seal and later attributing illness or misfortune to divine reprisal rather than coincidence. Humans are storytellers. We seek patterns, especially when confronted with the unknown. By the early 20th century, newspapers eagerly amplified tales of tomb curses. Sensational headlines sold copies, and ancient Egypt provided irresistible drama. Reports of mysterious illnesses and untimely deaths were framed as supernatural vengeance rather than ordinary mortality. And yet, curses were never merely inventions of modern media. They grew from a deep cultural conviction that disturbing the dead violated cosmic order. You pause in the dim stillness, aware of how suggestion shapes perception. The deeper you stand in this tomb, the more your senses seem to amplify every sound, the soft shift of dust, the whisper of fabric against stone, the rhythm of your own breath. Nothing threatens you, and still you tread carefully, because curses, whether supernatural or psychological, operate on a simple truth. When we cross boundaries meant to remain closed, we carry the weight of that act with us. The Egyptians designed tombs not just to protect bodies, but to preserve balance between worlds. To disturb that balance invited consequence, divine, social, or internal. Your light moves forward, tracing the corridor deeper into shadow. Behind you linger warnings carved in stone. Ahead lies the long history of those who ignored them, and the stories that followed. And somewhere between belief and coincidence, fear and physiology, reverence and intrusion, the idea of the curse continues to walk beside anyone who enters a tomb and wonders what, if anything, might follow them. As you continue through the dim passage, the ancient world begins to overlap with a much more recent past. The stillness of the tomb remains unchanged, yet the story of who enters these spaces shifts dramatically in the 1800s, when Egypt became the focus of intense European fascination. What began as scholarly curiosity soon transformed into an obsession, part archaeology, part treasure hunting, part spectacle. You pause near a collapsed section of plaster where faint boot impressions, preserved in hardened dust, hint at relatively recent intrusion. Not ancient sandals this time, but heavier footwear, the kind worn by explorers, soldiers, and antiquarians moving through the desert under imperial flags. By the early 19th century, Egyptology had not yet become a formal scientific discipline. Collectors, diplomats, adventurers, and opportunists sought artifacts from museums and private collections across Europe. Mummies, statues, papyri, and jewelry were shipped abroad in astonishing quantities. Entire tomb assemblages were removed from their original contexts, their stories fragmented across continents. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, 1798-1801, helped ignite European fascination with ancient Egyptian culture. His scholars documented monuments and inscriptions in extraordinary detail, publishing the monumental description de l'Egypte. Although historians still debate the expedition's long-term impact, it undeniably fueled Western interest in Egypt's ancient past. Soon, travelers began arriving not merely to observe, but to acquire. You sweep your light across the wall and imagine 19th century explorers entering with lanterns, notebooks, and crates. Some were meticulous observers who advanced knowledge of hieroglyphs and burial practices. Others prioritized speed and profit, prying artifacts loose with little regard for preservation. The dryness that preserved mummies also preserved textiles, garlands, sandals, and even food offerings, details that fascinated collectors and scholars alike. But the race to obtain such items often caused irreversible damage. One particularly strange Victorian trend involved mummy unwrapping parties, where wealthy hosts invited guests to witness the unwrapping of ancient remains. Originally framed as scientific demonstrations, these events quickly became macabre entertainment. Attendees reported the strong odor of resins and bitumen, sometimes described as medicinal, sometimes as overwhelming. Oddly enough, powdered mummy remains were once sold in Europe as a medicinal substance called mumia, believed to have healing properties. The practice dates back centuries and reflects how ancient remains were commodified in ways the original embalmers could never have imagined. You pause beside a carved offering scene and imagine fragments like these removed and displayed in drawing rooms thousands of miles away. A funerary mask mounted above a fireplace, shapty figures arranged on shelves, sacred objects transformed into curiosities. Yet not all who came sought profit. Some early Egyptologists worked tirelessly to record inscriptions and preserve fragile sites. Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822 opened the door to understanding ancient Egyptian texts. Suddenly, tomb walls could speak again. Historians still argue whether early excavation methods caused more harm than preservation. But without their documentation, much knowledge might have been lost entirely. Your beam catches faint pencil markings near a damaged relief, likely survey notes from an early explorer. Such markings, though intrusive, sometimes provide valuable records of features now eroded or destroyed. The 19th century also saw the rise of large museum collections. Institutions in London, Paris, Berlin, and Turin assembled vast holdings of Egyptian antiquities. While these collections preserved artifacts from deterioration and theft, they also removed them from their cultural and geographic context, a subject of ongoing debate today. Meanwhile, local Egyptian communities often participated in excavations as laborers and guides, though their contributions were rarely credited in early publications. The work was collaborative, even if recognition was not. Outside the tomb, the desert remained indifferent to global fascination. Sand drifted. The Nile flooded and receded. Villages continued rhythms older than empire. Inside, the ancient silence absorbed the footsteps of new visitors. Your light glides across a painted guardian figure whose gaze remains unchanged despite centuries of intrusion. For the ancient builders, the tomb was eternal. For the modern world, it became a site of discovery and sometimes disruption. This period of exploration transformed ancient Egypt from distant legend into tangible history. Mummies were no longer mythic relics. They were human remains with names, lineages, and stories preserved in linen and resin. Yet the growing visibility of mummies also deepened their mystique. Exhibitions drew crowds. Newspapers published sensational accounts. Ancient burial practices, once sacred and hidden, became public spectacle. You stand quietly in the corridor, aware that the tomb has witnessed multiple eras of intrusion. Ancient looters, medieval wanderers, colonial-era explorers, modern archaeologists, each entered with different motives. Survival, curiosity, scholarship, profit. The tomb endured them all. And as your light moves across walls carved to outlast dynasties, you sense the strange intersection of reverence and intrusion that defines the modern encounter with ancient Egypt. A collision between preservation and possession, knowledge and disruption, wonder and appropriation. Behind you lies the world that forgot these chambers. Ahead lies the moment that would make the idea of mummy curses famous across the globe. As you continue through the dim passage, the ancient world begins to overlap with a much more recent past. The stillness of the tomb remains unchanged, yet the story of who enters these spaces shifts dramatically in the 1800s, when Egypt became the focus of intense European fascination. What began as scholarly curiosity soon transformed into an obsession, part archaeology, part treasure hunting, part spectacle. You pause near a collapsed section of plaster where faint boot impressions, preserved in hardened dust, hint at relatively recent intrusion. Not ancient sandals this time, but heavier footwear, the kind worn by explorers, soldiers, and antiquarians moving through the desert under imperial flags. By the early 19th century, Egyptology had not yet become a formal scientific discipline. Collectors, diplomats, adventurers, and opportunists sought artifacts from museums and private collections across Europe. Mummies, statues, papyri, and jewelry were shipped abroad in astonishing quantities. Entire tomb assemblages were removed from their original contexts, their stories fragmented across continents. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, 1798-1801, helped ignite European fascination with ancient Egyptian culture. His scholars documented monuments and inscriptions in extraordinary detail, publishing the monumental description de l'Egypte. Although historians still debate the expedition's long-term impact, it undeniably fueled Western interest in Egypt's ancient past. Soon, travelers began arriving not merely to observe, but to acquire. You sweep your light across the wall and imagine 19th century explorers entering with lanterns, notebooks, and crates. Some were meticulous observers who advanced knowledge of hieroglyphs and burial practices. Others prioritized speed and profit, prying artifacts loose with little regard for preservation. The dryness that preserved mummies also preserved textiles, garlands, sandals, and even food offerings, details that fascinated collectors and scholars alike. But the race to obtain such items often caused irreversible damage. One particularly strange Victorian trend involved mummy unwrapping parties, where wealthy hosts invited guests to witness the unwrapping of ancient remains. Originally framed as scientific demonstrations, these events quickly became macabre entertainment. Attendees reported the strong odor of resins and bitumen, sometimes described as medicinal, sometimes as overwhelming. Oddly enough, powdered mummy remains were once sold in Europe as a medicinal substance called mumia, believed to have healing properties. The practice dates back centuries and reflects how ancient remains were commodified in ways the original embalmers could never have imagined. You pause beside a carved offering scene and imagine fragments like these removed and displayed in drawing rooms thousands of miles away. A funerary mask mounted above a fireplace, Shabti figures arranged on shelves, sacred objects transformed into curiosities. Yet not all who came sought profit. Some early Egyptologists worked tirelessly to record inscriptions and preserve fragile sites. Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822 opened the door to understanding ancient Egyptian texts. Suddenly, tomb walls could speak again. Historians still argue whether early excavation methods caused more harm than preservation, but without their documentation, much knowledge might have been lost entirely. Your beam catches faint pencil markings near a damaged relief, likely survey notes from an early explorer. Such markings, though intrusive, sometimes provide valuable records of features now eroded or destroyed. The 19th century also saw the rise of large museum collections. Institutions in London, Paris, Berlin, and Turin assembled vast holdings of Egyptian antiquities. While these collections preserved artifacts from deterioration and theft, they also removed them from their cultural and geographic context, a subject of ongoing debate today. Meanwhile, local Egyptian communities often participated in excavations as laborers and guides, though their contributions were rarely credited in early publications. The work was collaborative, even if recognition was not. Outside the tomb, the desert remained indifferent to global fascination. Sand drifted. The Nile flooded and receded. Villages continued rhythms older than empire. Inside, the ancient silence absorbed the footsteps of new visitors. Your light glides across a painted guardian figure whose gaze remains unchanged despite centuries of intrusion. For the ancient builders, the tomb was eternal. For the modern world, it became a site of discovery and sometimes disruption. This period of exploration transformed ancient Egypt from distant legend into tangible history. Mummies were no longer mythic relics. They were human remains with names, lineages, and stories preserved in linen and resin. Yet the growing visibility of mummies also deepened their mystique. Exhibitions drew crowds. Newspapers published sensational accounts. Ancient burial practices, once sacred and hidden, became public spectacle. You stand quietly in the corridor, aware that the tomb has witnessed multiple eras of intrusion. Ancient looters, medieval wanderers, colonial-era explorers, modern archaeologists, each entered with different motives. Survival, curiosity, scholarship, profit. The tomb endured them all. And as your light moves across walls carved to outlast dynasties, you sense the strange intersection of reverence and intrusion that defines the modern encounter with ancient Egypt. A collision between preservation and possession, knowledge and disruption, wonder and appropriation. Behind you lies the world that forgot these chambers. Ahead lies the moment that would make the idea of mummy curses famous across the globe. As the corridor stretches onward, the dramatic stories begin to soften under a quieter, more analytical light. The guardians on the walls remain still, the painted spells unchanged. Yet modern science has stepped into these ancient spaces with microscopes, air samplers, and chemical analysis kits, asking practical questions about what truly lingers inside sealed tombs. The answer, it turns out, is not supernatural, but it is far from empty. When tombs remain sealed for centuries, they create stable microenvironments. Organic materials such as linen wrappings, wooden coffins, plant garlands, resins, oils, and food offerings slowly break down, releasing particles into the enclosed air. In a space undisturbed for millennia, dust accumulates in fine layers composed of mineral grains, organic fibers, and microscopic spores. When a sealed chamber is opened, these particles can become airborne. Scientists studying tomb environments have identified fungi such as Aspergillus and Penicillium, along with bacteria that thrive on organic material. Inhalation of high concentrations of fungal spores may cause respiratory irritation, allergic reactions, or infections in individuals with compromised immune systems. While healthy visitors face minimal risk, prolonged exposure in poorly ventilated spaces can cause symptoms such as coughing, eye irritation, headaches, or dizziness. Early explorers, unaware of these hazards, often entered tombs without ventilation, masks, or protective equipment. Symptoms experienced afterward were easily interpreted as supernatural punishment rather than environmental exposure. Historians still argue whether reports of sudden illness following tomb openings were exaggerated for dramatic effect. But modern conservation protocols treat enclosed archaeological sites with careful caution. You notice the corridors still air and imagine how quickly dust would rise if the floor were disturbed. Even your careful steps stir faint motes that shimmer briefly in the beam of your light before settling again. Beyond microorganisms, certain burial materials themselves can produce irritants. Bitumen, used in later mummification periods, emits a strong odor when disturbed. Resins and oils oxidize over time, releasing compounds that may irritate the respiratory system. Ammonia and sulfur compounds can also form during decomposition. In rare cases, sealed spaces can accumulate carbon dioxide or reduced oxygen levels, particularly in deeper chambers with limited airflow. Such conditions can cause lightheadedness, another experience once attributed to curses or spirits. Yet science does not strip these spaces of mystery, it reframes it. Modern CT scans allow researchers to examine mummies without unwrapping them, revealing age, injuries, dental health, and even evidence of disease. X-rays have shown amulets hidden within wrappings, while DNA analysis has traced familial relationships among royal lineages. Chemical analysis of resins reveals trade networks stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa. Isotopic testing of hair and bone provides clues about diet and migration. What once seemed silent now speaks through data. Your light passes over a painted offering table, and you consider that residue invisible to the eye may still contain chemical traces of oils poured during rituals thousands of years ago. Molecules endure long after scent fades. Even the pigments on tomb walls have been studied to understand ancient material science. Egyptian blue, one of the earliest synthetic pigments, emits infrared luminescence under specialized imaging, allowing faded designs to be seen again. Scholars debate the degree to which embalmers understood the antimicrobial properties of natron and resins. While their practices were grounded in religious belief, some techniques proved scientifically effective at slowing decay. Preservation emerged from the intersection of ritual knowledge and empirical observation. In conservation labs today, specialists monitor humidity, temperature, and microbial growth to protect fragile remains. Ironically, exposure to modern air can sometimes accelerate deterioration, making controlled environments essential for preservation. You pause and listen to the quiet, aware that nothing here is truly inert. Even in stillness, chemical reactions proceed slowly, materials age, and microscopic life persists. Science explains much, yet it does not erase the emotional weight of these spaces. Knowing that mold spores exist does not fully dissolve the sensation of stepping into a sealed chamber built for eternity, because part of the unease arises not from physical danger, but from crossing temporal boundaries. You are standing where others stood 3,000 years ago, breathing air that has lingered in darkness since their voices faded. The rational mind understands airflow, particulates, and microbial life. The human mind still feels the hush. Your light drifts along the corridor walls, illuminating symbols meant to protect, guide, and reassure the dead. Today, scientists in gloves and masks continue their work under bright lamps rather than flickering torches, yet their purpose echoes the past: preservation, understanding, continuity. The curse, it seems, dissolves under careful study, replaced by spores, chemistry, and environmental science. And yet, even with explanations in hand, you find yourself stepping gently, speaking softly, and respecting the stillness, because knowledge explains the air you breathe, but reverence shapes how you breathe it. As you stand in the hush of the corridor, surrounded by symbols meant to outlast time, a quieter question begins to take shape, not about curses, microbes, or history, but about why these preserved bodies still unsettle us. You know the science now. You understand the rituals. You've seen the careful preparation meant to ensure eternity, and yet something in the presence of a mummy resists easy comfort. Part of this reaction lies deep in human psychology. Across cultures, the human brain is finely tuned to recognize faces and bodies. When we encounter a preserved human form, neither fully alive nor fully skeletal, it occupies an ambiguous space that psychologists call the uncanny. The features remain recognizable, but altered by time and preservation. The familiar becomes unfamiliar. The result is a subtle cognitive dissonance that can produce unease. You shine your light across a painted funerary mask, its serene expression unchanged by centuries. Masks like these were meant to preserve identity, to present an idealized eternal self. Gold signified divine flesh, painted eyes restored sight. The intention was comfort and continuity. But to modern viewers, the stillness can feel watchful. Historians note that ancient Egyptians did not fear the preserved body. On the contrary, preservation ensured survival. The mummy was not a relic of death but a vessel of continuity. To them, decay was the true danger, a second death that threatened oblivion. Modern cultures, by contrast, often distance themselves from physical death. In many societies, bodies are removed quickly from daily life, prepared behind closed doors, and returned only briefly for ritual farewell. Preservation exists, but it is discreet. We are less accustomed to prolonged physical presence. This cultural distance can make mummies feel confrontational, as if they refuse to disappear in the way we expect the dead to do. Your beam moves across a relief of the bob bird hovering above a wrapped form. To the Egyptians, the soul returned nightly. The body remained a home, not an abandoned shell. This continuity contrasts sharply with modern notions of separation between body and spirit. There is also the matter of time. Mummies collapse thousands of years into a single encounter. Standing before one, you confront the reality that a person lived, breathed, hoped, feared, and was loved, and that their existence has endured beyond empires, languages, and belief systems. That compression of time can feel overwhelming. Historians still argue whether Victorian fascination with mummies reflected scientific curiosity, colonial dominance, or an unspoken confrontation with mortality during an era of rapid industrial change. Perhaps it was all three. Even today, museum visitors often lower their voices when entering mummy galleries. The instinct toward quiet respect transcends belief. It is a recognition of shared humanity across millennia. Yet popular culture has also reshaped the mummy into a figure of horror, lumbering, cursed, and vengeful. Early 20th century films portrayed mummies as resurrected threats, blending ancient imagery with modern anxieties about colonialism, disease, and the unknown. These portrayals linger in collective imagination, influencing how people react even when standing before genuine artifacts. You pause and listen to the soft rhythm of your breathing, aware that unease does not necessarily signal danger. It signals recognition. This was a person. They prepared for eternity. They were mourned. They were protected with layers of ritual and devotion. And somehow, across 3,000 years, you are sharing the same quiet air. The dim corridor reinforces this intimacy. The silence invites reflection rather than fear. Even the guardians painted on the walls feel less like threats and more like witnesses, reminders that the boundary between life and death has always been treated with reverence. Psychologists suggest that confronting mortality can heighten appreciation for life, deepen empathy, and sharpen awareness of time's passage. Ancient Egyptians did not avoid this confrontation. They built an entire civilization around preparation for what comes after. Your light passes over a jade pillar carved into the wall, symbol of stability and endurance. Its repeated form suggests continuity across generations, a cultural reassurance that order persists even as individuals pass on. The unease you feel may not be fear at all. It may be humility, a recognition that the human desire to be remembered, protected, and guided beyond death transcends geography and era. That the same questions asked along the Nile thousands of years ago still echo quietly today. You shift your weight, careful not to disturb the dust settled across centuries. The stillness here does not feel hostile, it feels patient. And in that patience, the mummy ceases to be an object of dread and becomes instead a bridge between past and present, science and belief, mortality and memory. The corridor stretches onward into deeper shadow, but your steps feel steadier now, guided less by curiosity alone and more by a quiet respect for the lives preserved in linen and time. Because what unsettles us is not the presence of the ancient dead. It is the realization that they are not so different from us at all. The corridor gradually narrows, guiding you back toward the tomb's outer threshold, though it feels less like leaving and more like returning from somewhere inward and immeasurable. The air remains cool and dry, unchanged by centuries of silence, and your footsteps fall with the same soft restraint you carried into the depths. Behind you lie chambers of preparation, protection, judgment, and guidance, a carefully constructed path designed to carry a person beyond death and into continuity. You pause once more beside a sealed inner doorway, its plaster impressions faint but enduring. The jackal seal of Anubis is barely visible now, worn by time yet unmistakable in form. This seal once declared closure, protection, and permanence. It marked the boundary between the world of breath and the domain of eternity. Ancient Egyptian tombs were not designed to be revisited. They were meant to remain sealed, their occupants sustained by ritual, memory, and cosmic order. Yet time, necessity, curiosity, and scholarship have all crossed these thresholds, layering new meanings atop ancient intentions. You run your light gently across the carved walls one last time. The symbols no longer feel ominous. They feel methodical, almost reassuring, a system built to ensure safe passage, moral balance, and protection against chaos. Every amulet placed, every spell inscribed, every layer of linen wrapped around the body spoke to a singular hope, that existence would continue in a realm where order prevailed. Historians still argue about the degree to which Egyptians believed these preparations functioned literally versus symbolically, but the emotional clarity of their intention remains unmistakable. They prepared not because they feared death alone, but because they valued continuity, the preservation of identity, memory, and harmony within the universe. Beyond the tomb entrance, the desert night waits in vast quiet. The same stars that shone above pyramid builders now scatter across the sky. The Nile continues its slow rhythm far beyond the horizon, as it did when priests sealed this chamber with fresh plaster and whispered final invocations into the dark. You step toward the exit passage, noticing how the faintest movement of air grows more perceptible as you ascend. The tomb releases you gradually, the way it received you, without ceremony, without resistance, simply allowing passage between worlds. It becomes clear that the idea of curses, though captivating, represents only a fragment of a much larger story. What endures is not vengeance but vigilance, not supernatural punishment but profound care. The ancient Egyptians built systems to protect their dead because they believed existence continued, and because remembrance mattered. Outside, sand has drifted and reshaped itself countless times. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have evolved. Religions have spread and transformed. Yet the chambers behind you remain, holding their stillness with patient dignity. You pause at the threshold and look back into the dim corridor. The darkness does not feel empty now. It feels inhabited by intention, by the careful work of embalmers, the murmured prayers of priests, the grief of families, and the enduring human hope that death is not erasure. Somewhere deep within the tomb, painted guardians still stand watch. Linen layers still cradle the preserved form. Amulets still rest in silent vigil. Words carved in stone continue to speak protection into the quiet. And time, relentless everywhere else, moves differently here. You step out into the open night. The air feels softer, warmer, alive with faint wind moving across the desert floor. Above you, the stars burn with the same steady light that guided travelers and priests alike thousands of years ago. For the ancient Egyptians, the stars were not distant suns but eternal destinations, the imperishable lights of the northern sky where the blessed might dwell forever. To join the stars was to escape decay, to exist beyond cycles of death and rebirth. You take one last breath of the cool night air and feel the weight of the tomb recede behind you, replaced by a quiet awareness of continuity, that every civilization, every person, every story participates in the long human effort to understand what lies beyond the final breath. The desert wind smooths the sand near the entrance, erasing fresh footprints as easily as ancient ones. The tomb remains, patient and composed, holding its silence as it has for millennia, and you carry forward the stillness it offered, not fear but perspective. The night settles gently around you now. The desert stretches wide and calm, its vastness softened by distance and starlight. Behind you, stone chambers rest in perfect quiet, their purpose fulfilled, their guardians undisturbed. Nothing follows you out except the slow rhythm of your own breathing and the faint scent of dust carried on the breeze. You begin to notice how soft the darkness feels compared to the deep interior of the tomb. Out here, the air moves freely. The horizon breathes. The world feels wide again. Somewhere far away, the Nile continues its timeless flow. Grains of sand shift in patient whispers. The same constellations that guided ancient priests drift overhead, unhurried and constant. There is comfort in that continuity. The people who built those tombs feared oblivion, yet they surrounded death with care, meaning, and preparation. They wrapped their loved ones in protection, placed amulets close to the heart, spoke names aloud so they would never vanish, and trusted that order would hold even beyond the final threshold. And now, in the quiet of this night, their stillness invites your own. Your shoulders loosen, your breathing slows. The long corridors, the watchful carvings, the layered linens and whispered spells fade gently into distance, like a story settling into memory rather than demanding attention. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be guarded. The desert holds its calm, and the stars keep their patient watch. You can rest here, knowing that across thousands of years, humanity has shared the same questions, the same hopes, the same quiet desire for continuity and peace. The wind moves softly across the sand. The night remains wide and steady, and sleep, when it comes, arrives as gently as drifting starlight. End of script. Sweet dreams.